Um, and move into we're gonna move into the second chapter a little bit here in book again. It's not necessarily about social studies per se, but just some generalized components. Talking about curriculum and lesson planning and some of those things. So I'm gonna review some of that stuff today and talk about maybe some things you kind of already know, but maybe not. We're gonna, like I said, review that a little bit. So just a couple of things that go along with that this week's our regular review of the chapter. And then a discussion about constructivism, touch on that a little bit. Again, you probably have heard about that some, maybe you know a lot, maybe just a little bit, but basically kind of just getting like your opinion a little bit on it, not like a super lengthy question here on that, but what is it? What do you think? Would you use it in the classroom? Might you use it in the classroom when you get in there? So pretty standard, simple response there to that. So, and then, yeah, our other stuff has been, it's been good on that. Things have been going good, in my opinion, on that. Get to this stuff maybe today for that. So, week 4 already, so a quarter of the way through the semester. So, no turning back now. Okay, so then as we jump into chapter 2, hopefully this is a little more conversation. I got some examples of some things as we get to talk about lesson planning and some of those things. So if you got questions or have a story to share, I'll ask you guys for a little bit of input as we're going through here. So it's not just me visiting the whole time, but so this part, this chapter is about the planning component for social studies. And the stuff that we talk about in terms of planning can go beyond social studies piece of that, right? But some will be about that. So hey, do you guys have any experience yet with lesson planning? Yeah, okay, a little bit, okay, all right. So what we try to have you guys do here in terms of lesson planning and by what you did up at United Tribes is a lot of detail in that, right? The more detail, obviously, you have when you plan, the easier things are when you get to that lesson or that situation, whatever it is that you're planning for. The reality of when you go into classroom is that all your lesson plans are not going to be that detailed, right? But it's practice component right now for us to think about. Get you guys thinking about the details sometimes that go into it, and how much goes into the planning piece. Based on experience from like when I was a new teacher, I thought that I had plenty of things planned. All of a sudden, I have 20 minutes left of a class period, and what do I do now? Type thing. That's when you have. Not saying that you have to keep the kids busy all the time, but if all of a sudden there's a lot of time, that's when behaviors and there's different things come up, right? So, good planning helps you out in a lot of different ways. So, an example out of the book here, you guys see that? Okay. Out of the book here, it talks about good planners actively seek materials, right? So we're talking about social studies or any of your other classes that you teaching, you will be teaching when you plan things, when you put a unit together, a lesson, whatever it might be, and you pull that material together, keeping it is important, right, in terms of organizing it. That might be a physical thing that you use that you could hopefully have room in your classroom to keep, or it might be a resource, a website, a video, whatever it is that you want to be able to keep together, right? So building a collection, a library, a place to store things is important for the material that you use. So, and then of course it gets easier after you've done it for a year or 2 years or 3 years, you start to build a huge, big library with that. So it used to be binders and I mean all kinds of like paper materials, right? But now we can do everything. We don't want to do everything digitally, but keeping all that stuff is much easier to organize, and we don't have to have that big binder of stuff unless we want to keep a hard copy of it. But most of our things will be digital. So as and it also talks about here, it's good to organize that material, that information under the standards that we're teaching as well, right? Rather than necessarily like first week, second week, etc. But organization with materials and standards super important. So a couple different ways that we can planning and be detailed in that in terms of how to how to build that. Looks like if we look at this table, this is not everything that we need to take a look at, but just some topics and content here. So like it talks about subject area mastery, planning and assessment, curriculum and standards, child development, diversity, et cetera. Knowing that means you might have skills in these different areas, right? So subject area mastery, you have knowledge of that, you might have skill in classroom management. How does that connect together? And knowing your subject, well, if you're able to fluidly talk about it, plan with it, get materials together, that helps keep kids on task and engaged. When kids are on task and engaged, there's less chance for some of that mischief or misbehavior to take place. Another thing that we talk about in teacher ed is dispositions, right? Maybe you've heard of that before, but a disposition is something that, or a characteristic that makes good teachers, right? Can you think of dispositions? It's got some here, right? But other dispositions are things that make people good teachers. What makes people a good teacher, right? What's a characteristic or a skill or something that a favorite teacher of yours maybe has had? It could be a people person, okay, right? So we talked about that. We've probably all had teachers that are super crabby and grouchy, right? That's not a real good disposition or characteristics of a teacher, right? They're probably maybe in the wrong field, or they need to retire, or whatever it might be, right? So things like, being a people person or approachable, flexible, patient, et cetera, all those things go along with those dispositions, right? So if you don't have some of those good dispositions right now, those are things that we can work on, as you work through the program and stuff. So here, planning and assessment, curriculum, so child development, for example, right? So questioning, asking questions, how you ask questions, right, is a skill, right? Because if you just ask yes and no questions, then we're not getting the kids to think critically, or to dive into like trying to figure out an answer for that, right? So part of the questioning piece is learning how to ask questions so that students can respond beyond just that simple yes and no type thing. So, which also connects to that positive personal interactions with students, right? So maybe somebody may not be the best at that when they decide they want to be a teacher, right? They're okay visiting people, right? But they don't have a hard time making that connection. But over time, practicing, being in the classroom, observing, all that stuff builds that up. And so anyway, so different teacher qualities here that are important in terms of being a teacher, and also part of that planning process, right? Because getting to know your strengths and what makes you a good teacher helps in that planning process. And if you know that you struggle with technology for whatever reason, right, that you probably know then that maybe like, I'm not going to do maybe a whole bunch of stuff on the Promethean board. I'm not going to do a bunch of videos or interactive stuff and things right away until you can learn how to do that and become better at that. So that's a big part of planning, as well as knowing yourself. So within the book, it's got a lot of scenarios here. This chapter also has some good examples of different lesson plans and unit plans and stuff that we'll talk about. So any thoughts or comments on like the importance of writing lesson plans? And we kind of talked about it a bit, but what is the value that, do you think?
It's more about a game plan or guideline rather than like an actual script.
Yes.
It allows you to decide where you want to go, but it shouldn't be like dictated word for word,
Right.
by moment.
Yep.
It should allow for some flexibility as long as you meet the goal
Right.
of the lesson.
Yep. Yeah. So your goal, or every lesson has an objective, right? Like, this is what the students need to learn. Okay. It may not be, typically you start with your standard, then from there you might have 3 or 4 objectives to get to that, right? So it may not be a standard per se that you're teaching to, but there are objectives, right, for that. So excuse me, the lesson plan, like we said, does help kind of give you a focus or a direction for that. And then there's multiple ways that you can go. Also, the lesson plan is a good thing to be able to look back on. So we get down here a little bit farther in this chapter, it talks about reflection. as a teacher, right? So we can put a lesson plan together and this is how we're gonna do it, all this time, 5 minutes is this, 10 minutes, 15, blah, 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 and just do all that. And then sometimes it can just go totally off the rails and go a different direction, right? So when you have that lesson plan, you can jot down notes in a book or type it on there, how you're comfortable keeping like track of how things went, and then you can reflect back on the next day or at the end of the week, whatever it might be. But the value of lesson plans is that it's something there for you to guide you. And now many schools are using electronic lesson plans, obviously, right? Some of them are even just a box that you click, this is the standard, this is the objective, I'm doing this. So some are super simple, right? Some schools require that you submit your lesson plans to the principal. Some if you've been there for 3 years, you don't have to submit lesson plans to the principal. Some don't care at all. I mean, it just depends on the school and your administrator in terms of what they want for you to turn into them or not to turn into them. So there's a huge variety of lesson plans. As we get down here a little farther, I'll share with you ours kind of looks like in terms of a generic outline for that. So like this here, it talks about this, there's psychological benefit for writing down and having a plan there with you. I don't know if you guys ever went into anything before where you didn't really have a plan. That makes me anxious sometimes if I don't quite know what's happening or going on. I mean, sometimes I can go flow on a lot of stuff, but like different things, I'm like, I need to know what's going to happen, how much time, etc. So it does help quite a bit by just giving us a little comfort in what's coming up. So again, as I talked about the reflective component of that, right? So it doesn't have to be, I don't know if you guys reflect on things, right? But some people write journal stuff, a lot. I'm not a big like journal person, but even if you just take notes, I used to have in my classroom, it's just a book. I think it was a little one, how about like yay big, right? It was all blank, but it had like, you could write the days in there. And so like I would just make myself notes on like how things went in the classroom on lessons, if there was student behavior, I mean, just anything that happened during that day that I needed to maybe look back on later. I jot down notes in there for that. That's also a good way, looking at like classroom stuff or student behavior, like if maybe, you had a student issue with a student this day and then it doesn't happen again for 3 weeks and then you had it again, but like sometimes you forget about those little things that happen, but then you can look back and say, oh wait, this happened here. But that little note stuff, and again, it doesn't have to be paper, you can do it on laptop or whatever you might do, but a little bit of reflection is important for us as teachers, right? So it's a good way to help us improve our teaching. That way, it's good. It's also good to have others watch us. Sometimes that's not like I'm uncomfortable, like someone's in here watching us, I'd be like super uncomfortable right now. I don't know why still I am, but as a teacher, I was kind of uncomfortable with that. But you can get used to or understand that if people are there to like just help you with that and it's not part of your evaluation, as a teacher, it helps. They can catch some things or see some things that maybe that you're doing that they can offer help with that. So reflection is an important component of that. So typically, sometimes we think of reflection as like, oh, what did I do wrong? But it's also like, what did I do right? So maybe I can replicate that in some other classes and lessons and stuff as well. So you guys do any reflection on things?
I tried to be have to write a reflection after being a lesson. Fill out their lesson plan template, or the lesson, and then it's part of our grade.
Yep. Sure. Yep. Good. And it doesn't have to always be right away. You teach a lesson and you sit down and reflect on it, right? You might come back the next day and think about it a bit more, process it. Because sometimes we're kind of hard on ourselves after we do something like, oh man, that part was really bad. But the rest of it was really good. So it doesn't always have to be right away. Sometimes it's beneficial to wait to do that. So this part talks about resources. So social studies, specifically talking about social studies ideas where you guys might pull resources or where resources might come from. You're gonna teach social studies. There's some there, obviously, but what's the biggest one like that you would pull from teach social studies?
I always had a textbook.
Right, yeah, so your textbook, right, is probably gonna be the first one that you look at, or a lot of times in that textbook or in that teacher's guide, it's gonna have some sources for you, right? Go to this website, go to whatever it might be. People all used to be like, put the CD in and pull the stuff out, but they got tons of resources, obviously. One of the things that you should definitely think about in terms of the social studies piece is what do you have locally, right, within your community? And so, like, especially if you have a diverse school, or even not necessarily diverse, but what can parents provide for support, right? Or what can community members or guest speakers, bring in? I mean, especially talking about history or current events on things, you'd have a lot of local resources that you can have access to. And again, depends upon if they can come in or not, or places, but we always talk about field trips. We always don't have local stuff, right? Because we're such a small community. So sometimes we're heading up to Bismarck for a museum or something like that. A lot of times it's also class trips as well. So, and of course, holidays are a good resource. If you can work on helping kids understand the meaning behind it, not just celebrating a holiday, but why is that a holiday happen with that? A good one coming up here would be Columbus and Native American Day, right? Especially North and South Dakota, they switched that from Columbus to Native American. What is that? Kind of what's the controversy behind that? I think President Trump talked about turning it back to Columbus Day or something like that. So all kinds of good things you can talk with your kids about when it comes to some of those pieces. So, but resources, yes, you'll have a lot with your curriculum. Hopefully, you will have a curriculum, a social studies curriculum, as you go into your school. And that's one thing I guess doesn't have to be, but things you want to think about is like, what is the curriculum at that school that you're going to work at, or you might be interviewing at for your language arts, your math, I don't want to say you want to make sure you have a curriculum, but it would be good to know, right? Because some places are more that like OER, like open resource stuff, where the teacher can kind of pick and choose. I mean, most schools do have a textbook for the subjects, but I don't know how often schools actually order social studies curriculum, because that's not a top priority for the schools. It's reading, language arts, and math stuff. So you might have a textbook from the 1990s or something that you have to teach from. Then you're probably going to be looking for some more resources online. So one of the great things with resources are video clips for social studies now. There's tons of stuff out there, right, that you can expose kids to with videos, YouTube, and even what's written before interactive like field trips, right? So you could pull up a museum or a location, and it could be interactive where you're right there. You could choose your location, what things look like. There's just a ton of resources connected to almost every subject when we're talking about history or economics, geography, et cetera. And so, especially with us being so rural, we don't necessarily have to take a field trip to places to get kids to be able to see that. If you got a PTA board or something in your classroom too, hopefully you guys will at least have that. That makes it big enough, or bigger that can be interactive. Kids can come up on here, touch screen, and things around, and be engaged that way as well. History Channel has good stuff too, like historychannel.com. If you're talking about history, some historical events that might have happened that you can take a look at. We also talked a little bit, I guess, about the family resources, parent stuff. Bringing parents in, I've seen it before for like talking about their jobs, right? Or different things that parents and families do. Yeah. we don't always know, that's a tough way in terms of getting parents involved. Um, you know, how much do we want them involved? We want them to do exactly right. So the schools do talk about parent engagement, parent involvement, but like, what do we want them to do? So if you want parents to come into your classroom, have something exactly like, what do you want them to do? Right? Because as a parent, oh, I can come in, but like, I'm not sure. If you have some expectations for them, then it might feel a little more comfortable. Like, oh, you just want me to come in and help at recess, I can do that. Or if you want me to come in and teach a lesson, I can't do that. Right. So definitely not coming in. Right. So, it talks here about sending out emails, newsletters, et cetera, to parents about things you're doing in the classroom. Right. And so it doesn't have to necessarily just be social studies, but if you lay out like covering this topic, this activity, if you can help in any way, looking for volunteers to do X, Y, and Z, parents might be a little bit more comfortable, family members might become more comfortable coming in. If you don't want parents to come in, which is kind of okay also, right? If you don't want them to be, engaged in everything, that's fine too, just give them some options. If you want to come in to visit and watch a little bit, great, maybe that's good enough for most parents and families, because it depends on their schedule, they're working all day, it's probably obviously not going to work for them to come in very often. So, you guys have any thoughts on that? Have you thought about like parent involvement, parent engagement in your classroom?
Parent involvement, that's the long-term study part.
Yeah.
That's because prior to working in school, I worked in the clinic for this town.
Okay.
And I knew most of the parents in that capacity.
Sure. Yep.
I don't want to see people in my classroom.
Right. I mean, so like if you have somebody like volunteers and people coming into schools, you do have to be a little careful with that as well, right? So if they have somebody coming in consistently, they have to get a background check, right? They got to be kind of cleared to be able to be in there. So some people may not have a background that will clear them to be able to come into a school full time or be around kids or whatever it might be. So those are things that play into that as well, so sometimes it's not, necessarily that parents don't want to be involved. They can't be involved maybe because of previous choices that they made. So we did talk about community resources here, but also current events. That's a pretty standard piece in like elementary social studies. I think we kind of talked about that already, right? That we see a lot of current events as part of that. Especially with younger kids, you can connect maybe not like complex topics, but you can connect things to elementary social studies standards about community and those types of things. So I think we talked last week, maybe it's the week before, about, like the election coming up. That's a good connection to social studies for the local election, and having pretend not trials, but kids get to vote. They get selected in their classroom and in their school and stuff. So kind of we're talking about lesson plans a little bit, the short-term piece of that, or what's happening each day. So long-range planning is a part of all of our stuff as well, right? Not just social studies, right? So we have to think about like how we're going to put all this stuff together. Here it gives an example of month by month, right? It's kind of hard to see there. It's fuzzy, but September, October, November, so on and so forth, right? So the standards here it talks about, I don't know what this is kind of the standards for it's like history there or something, right? So here they're talking about they're covering a lot of information in the year, right? So they're talking about pre-Columbia all the way up to 50 states and their organization and stuff. So they're covering a lot of information. This person here is just long range planning month by month. And again, when you long range plan, it could shift, right, and change again based upon student interest, their understanding, how many interruptions you have. Here, things are going to change based on weather, winter, right? Are you going to get school canceled? Last year, I don't think we had a whole lot of school canceled here, but there's 2 or 3 winters ago. There's a lot of snow and it was super cold. There was a lot of days that kids missed. So that is tough too, with us as teachers to shift things around. Maybe there's been 4 days, you did have school on a Friday or Monday, and I come back and trying to reintroduce things, so. Things definitely shift, so. Textbook, we talked about that. So when you use your textbook, think about some things here in terms of what can help you with that, right? So skimming through it to see what is all in there, right? Don't just take it and start from the beginning, right? And then try to work your way through that. And maybe that's how the standards look for whatever grade you're teaching, but maybe not. Maybe they start in the middle, something like that. So you want to scan it and see what it, skim it, not scan it, skim the book and see what it looks like. Look at your standards and see where they're going to fall in there. What units are going to give you more time to, right? What exactly you're going to teach, what's good in that book. The teacher's guide is your friend there for sure. It's going to give you lots of good material, information, and estimate on how long you might spend on a unit or a chapter. Supplemental is also important as well. Here it talks about different literature books, so connecting language arts to it, you know, so the theme, the time period maybe that you're looking at, what can you connect with some writings or some books that were happening during that time. So then another thing you want to look at is the assessment piece, right? Textbooks and curriculum typically have some kind of assessment if you're looking at chapters, units and stuff, right? So you could easily just take those, use them if you want, or you can create something more authentic that fits with your students. You know, obviously just know that if you're going to do an authentic one on your own, it takes more time for us as teachers to create, right? So sometimes we're in a time crunch, maybe we're just going to use those pre-made assessments, you know, which is fine too. So it just depends on your class, how things are going, and your students and where you're at with that. So sometimes I think we get stuck in like, well, the pre-made things are horrible, you can't use them. They're okay, right? Sometimes to use those. So especially as a newer teacher to figure things out, get your footing with that. So differentiated instruction, you guys have heard of that before, right? A little bit. So that's just shifting, maybe teaching to different levels within your classroom, right? So it started out with special education students. Initially, that thought is that you were gonna adjust the levels in your classroom while you were teaching. So but the differentiated instruction that we use now can be for your entire class, right? So you got high flyers that are super advanced. They're working on a bunch of different things. You can give them, you're gonna do some core instruction, and then you might break kids out in small groups or individual work to be able to get to that level where they are. So social studies might be a little bit different than your math and your English language arts reading stuff, right? Because things are a little bit different, right? But you take a look at that reading and language arts, that's going to play a lot into your social studies, right? So if a kid is a struggling reader, in the social studies component, they might struggle a little bit too, because they're probably going to be a little bit more reading and writing components with that. So those are some things that you have to take into consideration rather than just how much do they know about history compared to other students. So so things that you can do for differentiated instruction talks about here, peer tutoring, flexible grouping, and modified instruction, right? So flexible grouping, for example, you got kids at multiple levels, maybe together with the group working on a project. Okay? Or maybe you decide to do grouping based upon like reading levels, right? So you have a high group, a middle group, and a low group. Well, and you keep those through, say, throughout the first semester. Well, if at 9 weeks in, you're doing some assessments, you have a kid that was a struggling reader, all of a sudden has really gained some confidence and is doing well. You can move them, or you should move them into that middle group, right? So keeping groups static or the same all year long, you shouldn't do that. You should shift them, adjust them, but not like every week and everything like that. But you want to make sure you give kids the opportunities to as well. And kids can move down too if they're struggling at a higher level, for example. move down to that other group and stuff. So that's the idea behind flexible grouping, is that things can be fluid. With that. And we'll talk a little bit here later too, if we have time, about like different types of assessments, right? That can be used for, especially in the reading, you're talking about Dibble's assessment and things where we can see how kids are doing. Another thing that's important, culturally responsive, differentiated instruction, right? So knowing the background of your kids, their community that they come from. So if we're talking about schools around here, we're somewhat similar, right? We're not super diverse, right? Be diverse in like just individual people, but in terms of our background and culture, we'll be similar, right? But if you go to Bismarck, places where you have a lot of diversity, then that makes things a little bit different, right? So here it talks about paying attention to academic, cultural, linguistic, socioeconomic diversity of students. So we talk about diversity, it just doesn't mean our ethnic and background, right? Or our racial background. It can be socioeconomic. It can be what languages do people speak. And again, here it might be Lakota and Dakota. Kenny's not here to make sure we say Dakota, but in Bismarck, it might be Spanish, it might be Korean, it might be Chinese. There's all kinds of different stuff. So just understanding those things a little bit, and trying to bring some of those components into the classroom is good, especially talking about diverse components, or I'm sorry, differentiating components. Again, not that we'll be speaking in all those languages, but we might try to throw in a little bit of context based upon some of that background. So it takes a little bit more work, but sometimes it makes kids feel more connected if they understand that you're working towards understanding them as students and their families. Okay. Another thing to think about is scaffolding. You guys heard of scaffolding before? I was thinking about like scaffolding, like when you're doing construction or something, you're just putting more things on and building on it. So scaffolding is a good part of social studies as well, and help build upon prior knowledge, help build upon things that you previously did. So that's kind of where we talk a little bit about constructivism as well. So the theory of constructivism is emphasizing, or us as teachers, trying to activate students' prior learning and understanding, and their experiences help them learn new things, right? So it talks about here, learners' active role in building their own knowledge and understanding through their experiences and interactions. Okay? So a student's experience in local geography, right, might influence how they understand the rest of the state or the world or something like that, right? So the idea of that, again, doesn't mean that they just, if they don't know it, then if they don't have any experience in it, then they can't know it or figure it out. If they don't have experience in something, then our job as a teacher is to help provide experience for them so that they can use that experience down the road to engage in their learning, engage in their so there's lots of different theories in terms of type of isms, right? Like constructivism is just one of them based upon, like I said, kids' previous experiences, but behaviorism, for example, meaning that you're trying to teach kids, or you're trying to get kids to learn based upon students doing things either for their own benefit or to try the benefit of you as the teacher, right? So you're trying to model how you want kids to act or perform, behave. So yeah, constructivism, they construct meaning by relating new information to their existing knowledge by engaging with the material. Typically, constructivism is hands-on, reflective, and social component. Okay, so if you believe in constructivism, then it's not kids just kind of sitting in their desks and doing worksheets. They're more engaged and involved in their learning. Okay? And that can be done in a number of ways. Right? So it could be videos, it could be activities, it could be field trips, it could be all kinds of things. I did not stop sharing. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so a couple more things then. And you maybe have heard about this too, but traditional planning for units or lessons and then backwards design. There's also something called universal design for learning. There's lots of different ways to do planning components. So a traditional, or maybe call it like an old school learning of learning or not learning, but of planning was, okay, what do I want to teach the kids? You put these objectives together, right? And then you come up with activities and resources. What kind of assessment am I going to do? And then see if you reach the objective, students reach the objective, give them a grade. And backwards design then talks about what are the standards that the kids need to know, what assessment am I going to do so the kids can demonstrate that, what activities would fit in that, then give them rubrics and then see if the students ever reach that objective post school. Right. So in traditional or old school planning, there was often not a whole lot of thinking about the standards. It was like, oh, this is cool. This is what the textbook says I'm going to do. I'm going to do this, and then go back and look and like, oh, where's the standards fit in here? It doesn't really, it's okay type thing. But obviously, when No Child Left Behind, all that accountability stuff came in the 2000s, that shifted to like, oh, you got to make sure that we're hitting all the standards pieces. The universal design for learning is kind of similar, but UDL has a more flexible design in terms of you might be able to do multiple ways. So that's good for like differentiated instruction pieces, really big on that. Where here it talks about accessible learning environments for all learners. So while they're somewhat similar in their process, the UDL kind of gives multiple options for them. So we'll talk about that more as we go on, and then maybe you guys know a little bit more about backwards design and universal design. But it really depends upon again what you have for curriculum, what you've got built in already. Excuse me for that. But with backwards design and universal design for learning, it gives you, you start with kind of a big picture piece of that. Right? And then backwards, whereas traditionally, you might just take a look at textbook and you look at that chapter that you're going to do. That would kind of be how you started your plan piece of that. So, but the big piece in design is what are your results, what assessment, what activities? Maybe looking at those are your three pieces. Let's just the component. So it does give some good examples here in the book about some ways to design, use backwards design and the standards approach. I won't go through all of them. I mean, it's a lot of good information material. So you can use these for examples, right? As you get ready to down the road when we do some lesson planning and unit plans and stuff on that. So a big part, and I don't want to say a big struggle, is that the standards, unpacking the standards, as I call it, right? When you take any subject, you're going to have a lot of standards there, right? And so as you start to look through them, like, what does that mean? Where do I teach this at? One would initially think that, like, okay, I start with standard one and then I go all the way through that. But sometimes that's not the way that things work out, especially like with social studies, right? You might start with standard three and then just making this up and then jump back to standard two and then go to five. And then based upon maybe the order of your textbook or material or the time of year, right? With things. So it just kind of depends. That looks like. So yeah, especially with social studies, it may not be standard, you may not follow the standards from 1 to 10 or how many that they have there. So this next section there just talks a lot about an example for putting that together or designing. Let's see. So units and lessons are a lot different, right? So units, if you look at a typical textbook, You're gonna have chapters broken into units, right? Unit 1 might be 2 chapters, unit 2 might be 4 chapters, but they're kind of focused around a topic or a theme, right? So a lot of times with social studies, you can do a thematic unit, right, where you're connecting language arts to social studies or math or science or something, depending upon the topic piece of that, not every time, right? Here it gives an example of things happening in a classroom. So students learn less if on Monday they have a map exercise in latitude, longitude. Tuesday, they talk about a value exercise of 20 things they love to do. Wednesday, they visit their fire department. Thursday, they read the social studies textbook on American Indian tribes in the northeastern part of the United States. And Friday, they just do current events, right? Those are all social studies things, but they're not connected at all, right? So it's just haphazard random stuff. How you do social studies will depend upon your school district too. I think we've talked about this, right? Some schools will say we're doing social studies first semester, science second semester, or they might go Monday, Wednesday, Friday is social studies, Tuesday, Thursday is science, and the next week you flip flop, right? So, or some may have it every day too. It just depends on your school and what that elementary curriculum looks like for them. So, but so these individualized things, while they're still okay and meeting the standard, the more connected you are for units and planning and scaffolding, the more engaged and remember their ability to remember and recall things will be better. You guys have any experience in something like this from like your days or when you've been in classrooms previously in terms of social studies components or stories to share on that?
On studies learning prior to like sixth grade. We really surround, I mean, that's like my age, because I'm in thirties.
Yeah.
It's like it wasn't as hammered in as like
Right.
bonds.
Yep.
Math skills.
Yeah, and social studies, I think is definitely, I mean, while it's required and stuff, it's definitely one of those curriculums and topics that is, it's important, but it's not as important, right? So it gets some secondary treatment. I remember a lot of, I mean, I'm 49, so it's farther back than you guys, right? That the scholastic news or the current event stuff on Friday, you guys said, we still have those where you're reading through those things. Even in the middle school, there's a lot of like, answer the questions at the end of the chapter, right? About hand to man, they get graded, that type of stuff. So I don't remember that dynamic, engaged, social studies curriculum.
Or actually would stay.
Yep, that was a big piece of it, right? Yeah. Yeah, memorizing capitals, like you said, drawing.
It's like an actual social studies related assignment that I actually enjoyed, like remember enjoying prior to middle school. And the ones I do remember specifically in middle school are memorable because they were amazing.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sometimes we have those connections more of something we didn't like that we did enjoy, like, but and as we've said, social studies is, I mean, it's such a combination of almost different topics that fall underneath them, the geography compared to like a history. Well, they're kind of similar, but they're definitely like separate, right? Like so many of the economics and like sociology and different things like that. Well, we probably didn't have a sociology class unless you're in high school, but understanding people and places, events, and how they're linked together is part of that. So, let's see, we're running out of time. So before we run out of time, I'm going to pull up our lesson plan outline, right? So this is similar to the book's got some examples or some areas where you should have or what you should have in a lesson plan. And again, this might look different than lesson plans. I mean, it will look different than lesson plans you'll use in schools, right? But things that are pretty standard and important here, obviously, are standards. Right? So you're going to have objectives, you're going to have standard, right? Your procedure, what are you going to do? So as a new teacher, And when we had you do lessons, we want you to be detailed at that. Right? It's like a roadmap of if you were planning for a substitute teacher, telling them exactly what to do. That's what we kind of, or if you've ever substitute taught before, the more detailed, the better it is. Right? Because I've subbed before where it's been first period, it's just been generic. And sometimes it happens if somebody gets sick, right? And they don't have details for that. So, but it makes it a lot easier to get a lot of detail to be able to keep the kids from tricking them. So, obviously materials there, right? What things you can use. This lead in, so a lot of times we talk about like a hook or what even start the lesson with to get the kids engaged. And sometimes you don't have to have a big broad thing every time or a big exciting thing every time because maybe it's a repeat of a lesson or you're going in day 2 or whatever. But if you have something that can get their interest right away, it might help them engage. It could be a video, it could be a story, it could there's lots of things. And we talk about independent practice on that, right? So meaning what are the kids going to do either on their own or in a group to help understand or practice that skill, that concept, that idea, right? So again, could be a worksheet, could be a group project, it could be a conversation, there's a variety of things that they can do to practice it on them. And the performance assessment then is what are you doing? What's the assessment that the kids? What's the assessment that the kids do, students do that shows they understand the concept of topic? Is it a test? Is it a presentation? Is it a speech? Is it writing? Sometimes it could be something as simple as an exit ticket, right? When kids walk out the door, you're going to ask them, they're going to tell you a question, they're going to give you an answer, whatever. So it doesn't have to be super complicated, right? But it can be something simple. The last couple things then would be adaptations, modifications, right? So what might you do to modify that content, that lesson for kids? Modifications are for kids that might be on an IEP, right? For example, an adaptation or an accommodation would be for a student that could be on an IEP, but that would be something where you bring a barrier for them. Maybe something, if you had a student in a wheelchair, for example, and you were in a geography class and you're going to go on a walk to explore your school and stuff, and not every place had sidewalks, what would you do to modify that for that student? Maybe somebody has a golf cart, golf cart there, they can buy it. I'm just kind of making them off the top of my head, but those are things you have to think about that when you have students with, I think it doesn't have to be students that are special education, but it might be some kind of modification. It could be for students that are excelling, right? This is for my general class. I'm gonna do something that hard for them that are excelling. So, and then extensions would be what outside of the classroom is there things that kids can do beyond this connection to other subjects. I think we know what that means. And then what are you doing for technology? Right? Again, it doesn't have to be every class, but even if you're showing a YouTube video to begin the class where students are doing research on their laptop, they are whatever it might be, trying to get some connection to them. Again, it doesn't have to be every time, just to be thinking that. So question, I know Desiree students. So questions on this? I mean, fairly kind of standard, simple. And then we do always have a rubric with that, that kind of see what that. And let's see, was there anything else? There was lots. Any thoughts or questions? This obviously unit is much longer period of time, right? Than regular lesson units than individual lesson plans. Most of these things transfer over to your other subjects as well. This section here in the designing integrated units has a couple of units on Hawaii and what that would look like. So you can compare and contrast them. They have some good ideas there as well. this is where. Okay, any questions, any thoughts? So I'm pretty sure after this week, I'm start digging into some topics in social studies, some different ideas, ways to go about teaching that stuff in class, and some skills in them, so.